Her routine check takes an unexpected turn when a dog suddenly fixates on an old, battered suitcase. But what's inside isn't what anyone could have imagined. When the cops open it, they find an old tape recorder and mysterious tapes. And that's just the beginning. Who is the woman whose voice echoes from decades past? What secrets do her haunting confessions hold? And why does this ordinary woman feel so connected to her? This is a story of obsession, danger, and a search for the truth that will change lives forever. Don't miss this journey into a mystery that could have stayed buried, but refused to be forgotten. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn morning wrapped Grace Rivers in its crisp embrace as she adjusted her woolen scarf, pulling it snug against the gentle bite of the wind. At 59, retirement had given her the gift of unhurried mornings like this one, free from the rush of bell schedules and lesson plans that had dominated her life for so long. Ruby, her Irish setter, pranced beside her with characteristic enthusiasm, her red coat gleaming in the early sunlight like polished copper. "Easy there, girl," Grace chuckled, holding the leash firmly as they entered the neighborhood park. The path stretched before them, dotted with golden leaves that crunched pleasantly underfoot, creating nature's own symphony with each step. As they walked, Grace's thoughts drifted to her latest antique restoration project, a beautiful mahogany mantel clock from the 1940s. She'd spent a week carefully cleaning its brass fittings and replacing worn gears until it chimed perfectly again, each ring clear and true, like it must have sounded when it was new. The satisfaction of bringing old things back to life never got old, and she smiled, thinking about the gentle tick-tock now filling her living room. Ruby trotted happily beside her, occasionally stopping to investigate interesting scents in the dewy grass. The park was quiet at this hour, with only the distant sound of early morning traffic and birds greeting the day with their cheerful songs. Their usual route took them past the stone fountain, its water still flowing despite the approaching winter, creating a peaceful backdrop of gentle splashing. Suddenly, Ruby stopped. Her ears perked up, and her body grew tense like a coiled spring. Before Grace could react, the dog lunged forward, nearly pulling the leash from her grip, her paws scrabbling against the damp path. "Ruby, what's gotten into you?" Grace struggled to maintain control as her usually well-behaved companion barked insistently at something near the fountain, her tail straight and alert. Following Ruby's gaze, Grace spotted an object partially hidden under scattered leaves. As she drew closer, careful to keep Ruby in check, she made out the shape of what appeared to be an old suitcase. Its leather surface was weathered and cracked, with brass clasps that spoke of a bygone era, telling silent stories of past journeys. Grace's heart beat faster as she studied the mysterious item, her breath forming small clouds in the cool morning air. Years of watching crime shows made her hesitant to investigate further on her own. With trembling fingers, she pulled out her phone and dialed the local police, her other hand still firm on Ruby's leash. "This is probably nothing," she told Ruby, who remained fixated on the suitcase, nose twitching with interest. "But better safe than sorry, right?" Within minutes, a police cruiser pulled up to the park entrance, its tires crunching on the gravel. Officer Mitchell, a tall man with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair, approached them with measured steps. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, examining the suitcase with practiced caution. "You did the right thing calling us." He crouched down beside it, checking for any obvious signs of danger, his experienced hands moving carefully over the worn surface. After a thorough external inspection, Officer Mitchell deemed it safe to open. "Would you like to see what's inside since you found it?" he asked, glancing up at Grace with a reassuring smile. Grace nodded, curiosity overwhelming her earlier apprehension. The officer carefully released the clasps, and the lid creaked open with the weight of years. Inside, nestled in faded velvet lining, lay an old reel-to-reel tape recorder and several unlabeled tapes, their metal surfaces dulled with age. Officer Mitchell examined them briefly, turning them over in his gloved hands. "Nothing dangerous here," he concluded, straightening up. "Just old recording equipment. Would you like to keep them? Otherwise, they'll probably end up in storage somewhere, gathering dust." Grace looked at the vintage equipment, her collector's interest piqued by the mysterious find. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "Yes, I'd like to take them, if that's allowed." Something about these forgotten items called to her, promising stories yet to be discovered. Grace settled into her favorite dining room chair, the warm glow of her antique lamp casting a gentle light across the weathered suitcase. The brass finials on the lamp caught the light, creating dancing shadows on the wall. Ruby's tail thumped softly against the floor as she watched her owner from her favorite spot on the braided rug, her brown eyes attentive and loving. "Well, let's see what we have here," Grace murmured, carefully lifting the reel-to-reel recorder from the suitcase. Its metal surface was dulled with age, but the craftsmanship was evident in every detail, from the smooth controls to the precise lettering that had somehow withstood time. She ran her fingers along its edges, remembering similar models from her early teaching days in the music department. Beneath the recorder lay several tapes, their labels worn beyond recognition, the paper peeling at the corners. Grace selected one at random, her hands trembling slightly with anticipation as she held a piece of someone's past. She retrieved a soft cloth from her cleaning supplies and tenderly wiped away years of dust from the recorder's surface, revealing hints of its original shine beneath the tarnish of time. "Here goes nothing," she whispered to Ruby, who lifted her head with interest, ears perked forward. Grace threaded the tape carefully, following the familiar path marked by metal guides, her movements slow and deliberate. With a deep breath, she pressed the power button. The machine hummed to life, and static crackled through the speaker like rain on a tin roof. Then a voice emerged, young, clear, and filled with raw emotion that made Grace's skin prickle. "My name is Evelyn," the voice began, causing Grace to lean forward in her chair, drawn in by the vulnerability in those simple words. "I don't know who will find these tapes, or if anyone ever will. But I need to tell my story." Grace's breath caught as Evelyn continued, her voice trembling with passion and something that sounded like fear. "Ever since I was a little girl, all I wanted was to sing, to stand on stage and share my heart through music. People said I had a gift." There was a pause, filled with the soft whir of the tape and the weight of memory. "But dreams come with a price, don't they?" Ruby padded over and rested her head on Grace's lap as Evelyn spoke of late nights practicing in her father's garage, of small gigs in smoky clubs where cigarette haze hung like curtains, of the thrill of her first standing ovation when the crowd wouldn't stop clapping. Her voice carried joy and pain in equal measure, painting vivid pictures of hope and struggle in every carefully chosen word. "I thought I'd finally made it." Evelyn's voice quivered like an autumn leaf in the wind. "When he noticed me, when he said he could make me a star." Her words grew hesitant, heavy with unspoken fear that seemed to echo across the decades. "But there are some prices too steep to pay. Some love that feels more like a cage than a blessing." Grace pressed her hand to her heart, feeling the weight of Evelyn's words settle deep in her chest. The young woman's voice seemed to fill the room, bridging decades with its raw honesty, making the past feel as immediate as the present moment. Each word drew Grace deeper into a story she never expected to hear, yet now couldn't bear to stop listening to, as if she'd stumbled upon a precious secret that had been waiting years to be discovered. Grace's slippers whispered against the hardwood floor as she made her way to the kitchen. The morning sun painted golden streaks across her countertops while she prepared her favorite chamomile tea. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured the hot water. Evelyn's voice from last night still echoed in her mind. "Come on, Ruby," she called softly. The Irish setter's tail wagged as she followed Grace into the living room. The worn leather suitcase sat exactly where she'd left it, waiting like an old friend, with more stories to tell. Grace settled into her favorite armchair, the soft cushions embracing her as she reached for the next tape. Ruby flopped down with a contented sigh, her warm presence reassuring at Grace's feet. The recorder whirred to life. Evelyn's voice filled the room again, stronger this time. "I was 19 when I first sang at the Blue Note," she began. "Just a small-town girl with big dreams. That's where he found me. Victor Langley. He said he could make me a star." Grace leaned forward, clutching her teacup. Evelyn's voice grew softer, almost fearful. At first, everything was wonderful. Recording sessions, new clothes, promised contracts. But Victor, he changed. Started controlling everything. What I wore, who I talked to, where I went. The tape crackled, and Grace's heart ached at the pain in Evelyn's voice. She grabbed a notepad from the side table and began writing, determined not to miss any details. When the tape ended, Grace's hands moved quickly to load another. This one started mid-conversation. "The Pinewood Inn became my refuge," Evelyn said. "Room 212. It was the only place he didn't know about, where I could write my own songs without him changing every note." Grace underlined "the Pinewood Inn" twice in her notes. She added Room 212 beneath it, her teacher's instinct for organization taking over. Ruby raised her head, sensing her owner's growing excitement. As she reviewed her notes, Grace's finger traced over the words she'd written. The Pinewood Inn. Such a simple detail, but it felt important, like finding the corner piece of a puzzle. She drew a circle around it, the pen making a bold, dark line. Looking up from her notepad, Grace glanced at the remaining tapes. Each one might hold another piece of Evelyn's story, another clue to what happened to the young singer whose voice carried so much hope and heartbreak. She was determined to understand, to piece together the mystery that had quite literally landed at her feet. Grace pushed open the heavy library doors, welcoming the familiar smell of old books and polished wood. Warm afternoon light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the reading tables. Ruby waited patiently at home. Libraries weren't exactly dog-friendly spaces. "Grace, what brings you in today?" Mrs. Albright's silver-rimmed glasses caught the light as she looked up from her desk. Her kind smile made Grace feel instantly at ease. "Hi, Martha," Grace said softly, mindful of the library's hushed atmosphere. "I need help finding information about a place called the Pinewood Inn. It would have been active in the 1960s. Mrs. Albright's eyes lit up at the challenge. "Let me see what we can dig up in the archives." She led Grace through rows of filing cabinets, her sensible shoes clicking against the floor. After some searching, Mrs. Albright pulled out several yellowed newspaper clippings and a thick folder. "The Pinewood Inn was quite something in its day," she explained, spreading the materials across a nearby table. Artists, musicians, writers, they all gathered there for inspiration. Grace leaned forward, scanning the articles. Her fingers traced over faded words describing concerts, art shows, and poetry readings. The inn had been a creative haven until it closed its doors in the late 1960s. "Oh my," Mrs. Albright exclaimed, pulling out a large photograph. "Look at this group shot from '65. Grace's heart skipped a beat. There, among the crowd of artists on the inn's sprawling front porch, stood a young woman with striking features. Her dark hair fell in gentle waves, and even in the black and white image, Her eyes seemed to hold a haunting intensity. In the corner of the photograph, someone had written EW in faded blue ink. "That's her," Grace whispered, her fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the image. "That's Evelyn." The woman in the photograph matched the voice from the tapes perfectly. Proud but vulnerable, confident yet hiding something behind her smile. Grace felt goosebumps rise on her arms as past and present seemed to connect in that moment. "Would you like me to make a copy?" Mrs. Albright asked, noting Grace's intense reaction. Grace nodded, still studying the photograph. The old inn loomed in the background, its Victorian architecture grand even in the grainy image. As Mrs. Albright went to make the copy, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she was one step closer to understanding the mystery of Evelyn Winters. She carefully gathered the copied materials, thanked Mrs. Albright, and tucked them safely in her bag. The photograph of Evelyn felt like both a gift and a responsibility. Another piece of the puzzle that had quite literally fallen into her path. The morning sun painted long shadows across the winding road as Grace guided her car toward the outskirts of town. Ruby sat in the passenger seat, her nose pressed against the window, watching golden leaves dance in the autumn breeze. Grace's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her heart beating a little faster with each mile that brought her closer to the Pinewood Inn. "Almost there, girl," Grace whispered to Ruby, more to calm her own nerves than anything else. Through gaps in the dense trees, she caught her first glimpse of the inn end. The once grand building stood like a forgotten sentinel, its weathered wooden boards barely visible beneath thick curtains of ivy. Nature had slowly reclaimed the property, with wild bushes and tall grass obscuring the path to the entrance. Grace parked her car and took a deep breath. Ruby's tail wagged encouragingly as they made their way toward the building. The wooden steps creaked under their feet as they climbed onto the wraparound porch. Inside, Grace switched on her flashlight, its beam cutting through years of dust and shadows. Ruby stayed close, her warm presence reassuring in the eeriness of the abandoned inn. Torn wallpaper hung in strips from the walls, revealing patches of aged plaster underneath. Their footsteps echoed through empty corridors that still held whispers of its glamorous past. In what must have been the inn's office, Grace found an old desk pushed against the wall. Most drawers were empty, but one stuck slightly. With gentle pressure, it finally opened, releasing a musty smell of old paper. Her hands trembled as she lifted out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. Beneath it lay several handwritten notes, the ink faded but still legible. A black and white photograph slipped from between the pages, marked simply with EW in careful script. Grace's breath caught as she read the first journal entry. "Victor says he knows what's best for my career, but his control is suffocating. I can't live like this anymore. The French booking agent called again. Maybe that's my chance to start fresh." The hastily written notes revealed more of Evelyn's desperation. "Train schedule marked, passport hidden. Must be careful. V watches everything." Standing in the dim light of the abandoned inn, Grace felt the weight of Evelyn's fear and determination in every written word. Ruby nudged her hand gently, bringing her back to the present moment. Grace carefully gathered the items, taking one last look around the dusty room before heading back to her car. Grace sat at her dining table, the evening light casting long shadows across the scattered items before her. The journal's worn leather cover felt smooth beneath her fingers as she carefully arranged it alongside the mysterious notes and photograph. Ruby dozed nearby, her gentle breathing a comforting presence in the quiet room. "There has to be more to this story," Grace murmured, studying Evelyn's handwriting. The faded ink held secrets, but the tapes, those could reveal everything. She picked up one of the reels, noticing how the magnetic tape had started to deteriorate at the edges. A wave of concern washed over her. She remembered her friend Janet mentioning Henry Walker, a retired audio technician who worked magic with old recordings. Grace found his number in her address book and made a note to call him first thing tomorrow. The next morning, after her usual cup of tea, Grace dialed Henry's number. His warm, gravelly voice answered on the third ring. Henry Walker speaking. Hello, Mr. Walker. My name is Grace Rivers. Janet Thompson recommended you. I have some old reel-to-reel tapes that need restoration. Henry's interest was immediate. Bring them over. I'll take a look. His workshop was tucked away in a converted garage on the other side of town. Grace stepped inside, amazed by the organized chaos surrounding her. Vintage equipment lined the walls, and workbenches held an array of tools and electronic components. The air smelled of metal and old vinyl. Henry, a man in his 70s with kind eyes and work-worn hands, greeted her warmly. These must be the tapes, he said, gesturing to the case she carried. Grace nodded, carefully placing the recorder and tapes on his workbench. They're from the 1960s, I believe. I found them recently, and they contain recordings of a singer named Evelyn Winters. Henry examined the recorder with expert hands. Ah, a Stellophone Mark III. Beautiful machine for its time. He turned it over gently. Yes, definitely mid-60s. The tapes need work, though. See this flaking here? He held one up to the light. Grace shared a brief version of her discovery and what she'd learned about Evelyn. Henry listened intently, his fingers still moving over the equipment with practiced ease. I can help, he said finally. Digitize them too, if you'd like. Preserve them properly. He pulled out a notepad. Give me about 3 days. I'll call you when they're ready. Relief flooded through Grace. Thank you, Mr. Walker. This means so much. Call me Henry, he smiled. And don't worry. These tapes are in good hands. Grace left the workshop feeling lighter, hopeful about what the restored recordings might reveal. The drive home gave her time to think about the journal waiting on her dining table, filled with more clues about Evelyn's life. Grace settled into her dining room chair, spreading out Evelyn's journal and the photograph before her. Morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow on the weathered pages. Ruby dozed nearby on her favorite rug, offering silent companionship. Let's see what else you can tell me, Evelyn, Grace whispered, opening the journal carefully. She grabbed a fresh notepad and began jotting down dates and events, creating a timeline of Evelyn's life. The entries jumped between moments of hope and despair, painting a picture of a young woman caught between her dreams and something darker. One particular entry made Grace pause. The handwriting was shaky, unlike Evelyn's usually neat script. VL promised me everything, said I'd be the biggest star of the decade. But now I see the truth. The contract wasn't about my music at all. It was about control. I can't trust him anymore. I won't. Grace underlined VL several times in her notes. The way Evelyn wrote about this person sent chills down her spine. She pulled her laptop closer and typed 1960s music producers into the search bar. The screen filled with articles about the era's biggest names in the industry. There has to be something here, Grace muttered, scrolling through the results. Ruby lifted her head, sensing her owner's tension, and padded over to rest her chin on Grace's knee. Grace absently scratched behind the dog's ears while she read. Page after page revealed stories about the golden age of music, but nothing jumped out at her. She refined her search, adding VL to the terms. The results narrowed considerably. Grace leaned forward, her heart beating faster as she clicked through several articles. Her phone's sudden ring made her jump. Ruby barked once in surprise. Grace grabbed her phone, recognizing Henry's number on the screen. Hello, she answered quickly. Grace, the tapes are ready, Henry said, his voice carrying an unusual edge of excitement. And there's something on one of them. Well, you need to hear it for yourself. Grace's hand tightened around the phone. "I'll be right there," she said, already reaching for her car keys. Grace pushed open the door to Henry's workshop, greeted by the familiar whir of machinery and a sharp metallic scent in the air. Tools and vintage equipment lined the crowded shelves, creating a maze-like path to Henry's workbench. "You're going to want to sit down for this," Henry said, pulling up a worn leather stool. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he adjusted some dials on the restored recorder. The tape began to play, and a woman's voice filled the room. But this time, it wasn't just speaking, it was singing. The melody started soft and hesitant, then grew stronger, wrapping around Grace like a warm embrace. Evelyn's voice was pure and clear, carrying emotions that made Grace's heart ache. "I've walked these streets alone," Evelyn sang, her voice trembling slightly, "searching for a place to call my own." The lyrics spoke of broken promises and dreams just out of reach. But there was something else, too, a fierce determination that shone through every note. "Listen to how she builds the tension here," Henry said quietly, turning a dial to enhance the sound quality. "Such control, such raw talent." Grace closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. She could picture Evelyn in that moment, young, hopeful, pouring her heart into every word. But suddenly, the song cut off mid-verse, leaving an abrupt silence that felt heavy in the workshop. "That's all there is," Henry explained, stopping the tape. "It's like she was interrupted, never finished it." Grace opened her eyes, finding them damp with tears. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I had no idea she was so talented." Henry handed her a small box containing the restored tapes. "There's more where that came from. I've digitized everything, organized them chronologically based on the recording quality and tape type." Grace held the box carefully, feeling the weight of Evelyn's story in her hands. The unfinished song played in her mind, a reminder of a voice silenced too soon, of art left incomplete. "Thank you, Henry. This means more than you know." As she gathered her things to leave, Grace felt a new sense of purpose settling over her. These weren't just recordings anymore. They were pieces of Evelyn's soul, waiting to be heard. She clutched the box of tapes close as she headed for the door, eager to spend the evening uncovering more of the mystery that had captured her heart. Grace sat at her kitchen table early the next morning, spreading out her collection of materials about Evelyn. The restored tapes were neatly arranged beside her handwritten notes and the old journal entries. Ruby dozed nearby in a patch of sunlight streaming through the window. "There has to be more to these initials," Grace muttered, circling VL again in her notebook. After a moment's thought, she reached for her phone and dialed the local historical society. An hour later, Grace pulled up to a charming Victorian house with climbing roses and weathered shutters. Dr. Eleanor Parker, a distinguished woman in her 70s with silver hair and kind eyes, welcomed her into a home library that smelled of old leather and paper. "Please sit," Eleanor gestured to a comfortable armchair. Books lined every wall, and vintage music posters added splashes of color to the cozy space. Grace carefully explained her research, leaving out the personal details from the tapes. "I keep finding references to someone with the initials VL. They seem to have significant influence in the music industry during the 60s. Eleanor's expression changed immediately. "Victor Langley," she said, her voice turning serious. "He was quite notorious back then. Brilliant producer, but—" she shook her head. "He had a dark side." "What do you mean?" Grace leaned forward. Langley had connections to organized crime. Everyone knew it, but couldn't prove anything. He was obsessed with controlling his artists, especially the women. Some called him a genius, others a monster. Eleanor stood and walked to a filing cabinet. There were rumors about artists who tried to leave his label. One young woman in particular disappeared completely. Grace's heart quickened. "Do you have any records about him?" Eleanor nodded, pulling out a yellowed newspaper clipping. "This is from 1965. Langley was some of his artists at a recording studio opening." Grace studied the black and white photograph. There, in the back row, partially obscured but unmistakable, was a woman who could be Evelyn. Her face was turned slightly away from the camera, but the resemblance was striking.
"May I make a copy of this?" Grace asked, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the fragile paper.
"Of course," Eleanor replied, watching her with careful eyes. "But be cautious with this research, dear. Even now, some people don't like questions being asked about Victor Langley." That evening, Grace settled into her favorite chair at her antique desk, the warm glow of her reading lamp casting shadows across the polished wood. Ruby dozed nearby, her gentle snoring a comforting presence in the quiet room. "How do I do this?" Grace whispered to herself, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her pen. The weight of what she was about to do pressed heavily on her shoulders. She began writing, then crumpled the paper. 3 more attempts followed, each ending in the wastebasket. "Too direct," she muttered. "Too suspicious." Finally, she found the right words. "Dear Mr. Langley, I'm researching the cultural significance of the Pinewood Inn during the 1960s music scene for an upcoming article. Your insights would be invaluable." Grace chose her words carefully, keeping the tone professional and detached. She mentioned her background in music education to add credibility, but avoided any reference to Evelyn or the tapes. The next morning, Grace stood at the mailbox, the sealed envelope in her hand. "This is it, Ruby," she said to her faithful companion. "No turning back now." She slipped the letter through the slot and walked home, her heart racing. The waiting was torture. Grace tried to stay busy, organizing her notes and listening to the restored tapes, but her mind kept drifting to the letter. Would Langley respond? What if he saw through her pretense? On the 3rd day, Grace's hand shook as she opened her mailbox. There, among the usual bills and advertisements, was a cream-colored envelope with elegant handwriting. She hurried inside before opening it. "Ms. Rivers," the letter began, "your interest in the Pinewood Inn is intriguing. I would be pleased to share my recollections of that remarkable era. Please join me at my estate this Friday at 2 p.m. The letter included detailed directions to his property outside the city. The formal tone and precise instructions made Grace's skin prickle. She read it again, noting how Langley had underlined the word remarkable. Was it emphasis or warning? Grace placed the letter on her desk, her earlier excitement giving way to apprehension. The reality of meeting Victor Langley, a man who might have driven Evelyn to disappear, suddenly felt overwhelming. Ruby sensed her unease and pressed against her leg, offering silent support. "I need to be careful," Grace said aloud, reaching down to scratch Ruby's ears. "Very careful." She pulled out a fresh notebook and began listing everything she knew about Langley, determined to be thoroughly prepared for their meeting. Grace's car crunched over gravel as she drove down the long, tree-lined driveway to Langley's estate. Massive oaks towered overhead, their branches casting dark shadows across her path. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as the mansion came into view, a sprawling stone structure that seemed to loom against the cloudy sky. "Deep breaths," she whispered to herself as she parked. The facade's weathered stone and gleaming windows stared down at her like watchful eyes. Grace smoothed her blouse and grabbed her notepad, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. The brass door knocker echoed ominously when she used it. After a long moment, the heavy door creaked open to reveal Victor Langley, tall and imposing despite his age, with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. "Ms. Rivers, please come in," he said smoothly, gesturing toward an ornate hallway. His voice was cultured, but held an edge that made her skin prickle. The study where he led her was dimly lit by heavy curtained windows. Dark wood paneling and leather-bound books surrounded them. Grace perched on the edge of an antique chair while Langley settled behind his massive desk. "So you're researching the Pinewood Inn?" His tone was casual, but his gaze remained calculating. "Yes, I'm particularly interested in the musicians who stayed there in the 60s, Grace replied, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Like Evelyn Winters?" A muscle twitched in Langley's jaw. "That name sounds vaguely familiar. One of many aspiring singers who passed through, I imagine." "She had quite a remarkable voice," Grace pressed gently. "The past is better left in the past, Ms. Rivers," Langley said coldly. "Some stories aren't meant to be uncovered." Before Grace could respond, a phone rang in another room. "Excuse me," Langley said curtly. "I must take this call." As soon as he left, Grace's eyes locked onto a stack of letters on his desk. Her heart pounded as she spotted one envelope with Ede Bew written in faded ink. Without letting herself think twice, she quickly slipped the letters into her bag. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Grace settled back in her chair just as Langley returned. "I'm afraid I have another appointment," he said. "I trust you found what you needed for your article?" Grace nodded, standing on shaky legs. "Yes, thank you for your time." She walked as calmly as she could to her car, the stolen letters seeming to burn through her bag. Her hands trembled as she started the engine, desperate to put distance between herself and the mansion's oppressive shadows. Grace's hands trembled as she carefully arranged the stolen letters on her dining table. Ruby pressed against her leg, offering silent comfort as Grace picked up the first envelope. The paper was yellowed with age, but Langley's bold handwriting remained clear and sharp. "My dearest Evelyn," the first letter began. Grace's stomach tightened at the possessive tone. "Your performance tonight was extraordinary, but you must learn to follow my direction precisely. I've invested too much in your career to let you throw it away with your stubborn independence." Letter after letter revealed Langley's growing obsession. His words dripped with a toxic mix of praise and control. "You belong with me, Evelyn. No one else understands your talent like I do. No one else can make you a star." Grace's hand shook as she read a particularly disturbing passage. "You've been seen talking to that songwriter again. I've warned you about him. Your career, your future, they're in my hands. Don't force me to take drastic measures." Ruby whined softly, picking up on Grace's distress. She reached down to scratch behind her dog's ears, needing the comfort as she continued reading. Then she found it, the letter that changed everything. Langley's normally precise handwriting had become erratic. The paper creased from apparent rage. "How dare you plan to leave?" The words were practically carved into the paper. "I found your ticket to Paris. Did you think you could fool me? After everything I've done for you? You're nothing without me, Evelyn. Nothing." The final letter in the stack made Grace's blood run cold. "I know where you're hiding," Langley had written. "You can't escape me. I won't let you destroy everything we've built. Meet me at the inn tonight, or I'll—" The letter ended there, mid-sentence. Grace stared at the unfinished threat, her mind racing with horrible possibilities. She gathered the letters with shaking hands, overwhelmed by what she'd discovered. The full weight of Evelyn's nightmare pressed down on her shoulders. The constant surveillance, the threats, the desperate bid for freedom. Ruby rested her head on Grace's lap as she sat back in her chair, trying to process everything. These letters painted a terrifying picture of Langley's obsession and the danger Evelyn had faced. The young singer's courage in planning her escape, despite the risks, filled Grace with both admiration and dread. The abrupt end to the final letter spoke volumes. Something had happened that night at the inn, something that had stopped Langley mid-threat. Grace felt closer than ever to understanding Evelyn's story, but the truth seemed darker than she'd imagined. Grace sipped her morning coffee, spreading Langley's letters across her dining table once again. Ruby dozed peacefully on her favorite rug nearby, her gentle snoring a comforting backdrop. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, making the scene almost idyllic, until Grace noticed something white peeking out from under her front door. Her heart skipped a beat as she retrieved the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with typed words that made her blood run cold. "Stop now, or you'll regret it." Grace's hand shook as she read the message again. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was probably just meant to scare her. Still, her eyes kept darting to the windows. By mid-morning, she noticed an unfamiliar black sedan parked across the street. It hadn't moved for hours. Ruby, usually calm, kept pacing near the front windows, her fur slightly raised. "It's nothing, girl," Grace whispered, but she didn't believe her own words. Later, while sorting through more of Evelyn's materials, movement caught her eye. A figure in dark clothing stood at the corner of her street, seemingly watching her house. When she blinked, they were gone. The sun had set when her phone rang during dinner. Grace answered with a tentative, "Hello." Only silence greeted her, punctuated by static and breathing. After several uncomfortable seconds, the line went dead. Ruby's protective growl made Grace jump. She hurried through her house, checking every lock twice. Her hands trembled as she drew the curtains closed, trying not to imagine what might be lurking in the darkness outside. In her bedroom, Ruby stationed herself by the window, occasionally letting out low growls at shapes moving in the shadows. Grace sat on her bed, heart pounding. Was uncovering Evelyn's story worth putting herself in danger? She thought of Evelyn's courage in the face of Langley's threats, of her determination to break free. Drawing a deep breath, Grace straightened her shoulders. She would be careful, but she wouldn't stop. Evelyn's truth deserved to be told, no matter what. Morning light filtered through Grace's curtains as she stood in her living room, staring at the battered suitcase. Despite yesterday's threats, a fresh determination burned within her. Ruby padded over, her tail swishing back and forth as Grace knelt beside the case. "There has to be more here, girl," Grace whispered, running her fingers along the worn leather edges. She emptied the suitcase completely, laying out each item with care. Then she examined every inch of the case's interior, pressing gently against the lining. Her fingers caught on something, a slight ridge that seemed out of place. Heart quickening, Grace worked her fingers along the edge until she felt a small tear in the fabric. "Look at this, Ruby," she exclaimed, carefully pulling back the lining to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside lay a single tape, its surface more weathered than the others. With trembling hands, Grace inserted the tape into the recorder. Static filled the room before Evelyn's voice emerged, softer than in previous recordings, but filled with quiet strength. "If anyone finds this," Evelyn began, "I want you to know I made it out. I couldn't stay. Victor's control was suffocating me. The night I left, I made sure everyone thought I'd vanished completely. I took a ship to Europe, changed my name, started fresh." Grace leaned forward, hanging on every word as Evelyn continued. "Sometimes I miss the music so much it hurts, the stage lights, the applause, but I don't miss the fear. I don't miss looking over my shoulder or having every decision controlled by Victor. I found peace here, teaching young singers in a small French town. It's not the life I dreamed of, but it's mine." Ruby rested her head on Grace's knee as tears welled in her eyes. Evelyn's voice carried such raw honesty, Such vulnerability. Grace felt as if she were listening to a dear friend sharing her deepest secrets. "I hope whoever finds this understands," Evelyn's voice continued. "I had to choose between my music and my freedom. I chose freedom." The recording ended, leaving Grace sitting quietly with the tape in her hands. After a moment, she moved to her computer and began searching through immigration records from the 1960s, determined to trace Evelyn's path to her new life. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Henry's workshop as Grace settled into a creaky chair beside his computer. The familiar scent of old electronics and coffee filled the air. Ruby had stayed home this time, giving Grace space to focus on her research. "I've been thinking about Evelyn non-stop," Henry admitted, adjusting his reading glasses. "Let's start with French databases from the 70s. Grace nodded, spreading out her notes on his cluttered desk. She would have arrived there sometime in the late 60s, probably using a different name. They worked methodically, Henry's fingers flying over the keyboard while Grace scanned through digitized newspapers and magazines. Hours passed, marked only by the quiet hum of equipment and occasional sips of cooling coffee. "Grace, look at this!" Henry suddenly straightened, pointing at his screen. A French music journal from 1975 filled the display. Grace leaned in, her heart quickening as she read. "In the rolling hills of Provence," Henry translated carefully, "a mysterious mentor guides young artists with the wisdom of one who has known both fame and shadows. This reclusive woman of many names and haunting melodies shares her gifts selectively, teaching those who seek not stardom, but truth in music." Grace's hands trembled as she jotted down the details. "That has to be her, Henry. The timing, the description, it all fits." They dug deeper into regional publications from the area mentioned in the article. Henry's expertise with archival databases proved invaluable as they narrowed their search to a specific village, Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. "Look at these property records," Grace said, excitement coloring her voice. "A small estate purchased by a woman matching Evelyn's description. The dates align perfectly with when she would have arrived in France." Henry smiled, clearly caught up in Grace's enthusiasm. "You've done it, Grace. You've actually found where she went." Grace sat back, overwhelmed by the reality of their discovery. After weeks of searching, Evelyn's path was finally becoming clear. She gathered her notes, carefully marking the village's location on a map of Provence. "Thank you, Henry," she said warmly. "I couldn't have done this without you." "Are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" Henry asked, his eyes twinkling behind his glasses. Grace nodded, already mentally preparing for what would come next. "I need to go to France." The French countryside stretched out before Grace like a watercolor painting, all soft edges and muted autumn colors. She stood at the window of her room at the Lavender Inn, Ruby's tail thumping against the wooden floor as they both took in the view of rolling hills dotted with cypress trees. "Well, girl, we made it," Grace whispered, scratching behind Ruby's ears. The journey had been long, but the peaceful village atmosphere already felt worth it. That morning, Grace set out to explore the village square, its cobblestone streets lined with weathered buildings in warm shades of ochre and cream. Ruby trotted beside her, drawing smiles from passing locals. At a small cafe, Grace ordered coffee in hesitant French. The elderly owner, Marcel, brightened when she mentioned her search for information about a reclusive artist from the 70s. "Ah, the music teacher." He nodded enthusiastically. "She lived in the stone house near the lavender fields, very private, but she helped many young musicians." Throughout the day, Grace gathered similar stories. A baker remembered Evelyn giving piano lessons to her daughter. A retired postman recalled delivering letters to the quiet American lady who always had a kind word to share. Outside the village's only art supply shop, Grace met Marguerite, an elderly artist with silver hair and paint-stained hands. When Grace mentioned the mysterious musician, Marguerite's eyes lit up with recognition. "Ah, you speak of my dear friend," Marguerite said in accented English, her weathered face creasing into a warm smile. "Please come to my home tomorrow. I have many stories to share about her." Grace's heart skipped a beat. "You knew her well?" "Oui, for many years." Marguerite nodded, writing down her address on a scrap of paper. "Come at 2 o'clock. We will have tea, and I will tell you everything I remember." Back at the inn that evening, Grace sat on her bed, Ruby curled up beside her. She held Marguerite's address carefully, as if it were a precious treasure. After weeks of searching, of piecing together fragments of Evelyn's life, she finally felt close to understanding the woman whose voice had first captured her heart through those old recordings. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the village in soft golden light. Tomorrow, Grace thought, she would learn more about the life Evelyn built after choosing freedom over fame. Grace pulled her woolen scarf tighter as she and Ruby made their way through the winding village streets. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered cobblestones, and the autumn air nipped at her cheeks. Ruby's paws clicked softly against the stone as they approached Marguerite's cottage. The house looked like something from a fairy tale. Weathered stone walls embraced by climbing roses. Window boxes still bright with late-blooming flowers. A delicate trellis arched over the front path, its vines turning golden in the crisp morning light. Marguerite opened the door before Grace could knock, her silver hair catching the sunlight. "Ah, you came. Please, please come in." Her accent was soft and musical, her smile warm and genuine. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls covered in paintings. Marguerite gestured to a comfortable armchair near the flames. Sit. I'll make us some tea." Soon they were settled with steaming cups. Ruby curled contentedly at Grace's feet. Marguerite's eyes grew distant as she began to speak. "Elise, that's what we knew her as. She came to us like a wounded bird. So quiet at first, but such kindness in her heart. She taught music to the village children," Marguerite continued, her voice soft with remembrance. "Such patience she had. And when she played—" She shook her head. "The music would fill the air like magic, but there was always sadness in it too." Grace leaned forward, captivated. "Did she ever talk about her past?" "Not directly, but sometimes, late at night, when we shared wine and painted together, she would speak of regrets, of leaving behind a gift she felt she had no choice but to abandon." Marguerite's eyes grew misty. "She said freedom came with a price, but it was worth paying." Standing slowly, Marguerite crossed to an old cabinet and retrieved a wooden box. "She left these with me before she passed. I've been waiting for someone who would understand their value." Grace accepted the box with trembling hands. Inside lay yellowed sheets of music, the notes carefully penned but unfinished. Between them were letters, photographs showing an older woman with familiar eyes, her face lined but peaceful. "She found peace here," Marguerite said gently. "But the music never left her heart." Grace brushed away tears as she carefully closed the box. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for sharing this with me." Rising from her chair, Grace hugged the box close. Her heart felt full to bursting with both sorrow and inspiration. She knew what she had to do. Evelyn's unfinished song deserved to be completed. Back at the inn, Grace settled at the small wooden desk by the window. Ruby curled up nearby as Grace carefully unpacked Evelyn's belongings from the box Marguerite had given her. Her hands trembled slightly as she spread out the yellowed sheet music, each page filled with Evelyn's elegant handwriting. "Look at this, Ruby," Grace whispered, running her fingers along the faded notes. The melody line was hauntingly beautiful, even on paper. She began to hum it softly, and the tune filled the quiet room. As the evening wore on, Grace became absorbed in the music. Her trained eye noticed how the composition reflected Evelyn's journey, flowing passages of hope interrupted by sharp, discordant sections that spoke of fear and pain. The unfinished portions seemed to cry out for completion. "I can feel what you were trying to say here, Evelyn," Grace murmured, picking up a pencil. Drawing from her years of teaching music, she began to fill in the missing measures. The melody flowed naturally, as if Evelyn herself were guiding her hand. Ruby padded over occasionally to rest her head on Grace's lap, offering quiet companionship as the hours slipped by. Outside, the village streets grew quiet, and moonlight spilled through the window, casting a soft glow on the pages. Grace worked steadily, lost in the rhythm of creation. Each note she added felt right, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The music spoke of survival, of finding peace after chaos, of building a new life from the ashes of the old. When Ruby finally nudged her arm with an insistent whine, Grace realized she'd been working for hours. Her back ached from hunching over the desk, but her heart felt full. She looked down at the nearly completed song, feeling closer to Evelyn than ever before. The music had become a bridge across time, connecting their stories in an unexpectedly profound way. Exhausted but deeply satisfied, Grace set down her pencil. The song was almost complete, transformed from a fragment into something whole. In the quiet of the room, she could almost hear Evelyn's voice in the melody, singing of both loss and hope. The morning light filtered through the inn's lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the wooden floor. Grace sat at the old upright piano, her fingers hovering over the ivory keys. Ruby stretched out on a worn rug nearby, her tail thumping softly against the floor. "Let's finish this, shall we?" Grace whispered, spreading the sheet music before her. The pages were a mix of Evelyn's elegant handwriting and Grace's careful additions, like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. Her fingers found the keys, and the melody filled the quiet room. The song started softly, mirroring Evelyn's early dreams, then built into something more complex, echoing her struggles, her fear, and finally, her triumph in finding freedom. Grace worked methodically, adjusting notes and harmonies until they felt just right. "That's it," she murmured, marking a change in the bridge section. "That's what you were trying to say, wasn't it, Evelyn?" The inn's piano, though old, had a warm, rich tone that seemed perfect for the piece. Grace played through the song again, this time with more confidence. Her teaching experience helped her understand where Evelyn had been heading with the unfinished sections, and her own emotional connection to the story guided her choices. Taking out her phone, Grace set it up to record. She played the piano part first, her fingers moving with certainty across the keys. Then, she carefully added Evelyn's restored voice from the tapes, matching the timing perfectly. The two parts wove together as if they had always meant to find each other. Evelyn's haunting vocals and Grace's sensitive accompaniment, creating something entirely new, yet somehow timeless. The song spoke of loss and redemption, of fear and courage, of a woman who chose freedom over fame. Grace's piano supported Evelyn's voice like a friend holding out a steady hand, guiding her story home. As the final notes resonated through the room, Grace sat still, letting the moment sink in. Ruby padded over and rested her head on Grace's lap, sensing the emotion in the air. Grace reached down to scratch behind her ears, listening to the playback of the recording. The blend of old and new, of Evelyn's voice and Grace's piano, created something magical. It felt like a conversation across time, two women sharing their understanding of what it means to find your own path. "It's finished," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. In completing Evelyn's song, she had done more than arrange notes on a page. She had helped give voice to a story that deserved to be heard, setting free the music that had waited so long to take flight. That evening, Grace settles into a comfortable armchair in her room at the inn, positioning her laptop on the small desk. Ruby curls up at her feet as she connects with Henry through video chat. His familiar workshop appears on screen, cluttered with audio equipment and vintage records. "I've finished it, Henry," Grace says, her voice soft with emotion. "Are you ready to hear it?" Henry nods, leaning closer to his screen. "I've been looking forward to this all day." Grace takes a deep breath and plays the recording. The melody fills the quiet room, Evelyn's restored voice blending seamlessly with Grace's piano accompaniment. The song tells a story of loss, hope, and ultimately freedom. Grace watches Henry's face as he listens, noting how his expression changes from curiosity to wonder, and finally to deep emotion. She sees him remove his glasses and wipe his eyes as the final notes fade away. "Grace, this is extraordinary," Henry says after a moment of silence. "The way you've completed her melody, how it captures her journey, it's beautiful. Have you considered sharing this with others? It deserves to be heard." Grace tugs at her sleeve, uncertainty crossing her face. "I don't know, Henry. This feels so personal, so intimate. It's Evelyn's story, her pain, her triumph. I'm not sure if making it public would honor or exploit her memory." "I understand," Henry replies gently. "But sometimes sharing something beautiful can help heal others too. Think about how Evelyn's story touched you. It might do the same for someone else." Grace glances at the box of Evelyn's belongings on her bedside table. "Maybe you're right, but I need time to think about it. For now, could you help me preserve the recording properly? I want to make sure it's protected, whatever I decide." "Of course," Henry says warmly. "We can archive it digitally, create backup copies. That way, it'll be safe until you make your decision." They discuss the technical details of preserving the song, and Grace feels grateful for Henry's support and understanding. After ending the call, she moves to the window, gazing out at the moonlit village streets. Ruby joins her, pressing against her leg comfortingly. The soft glow of the moon bathes the ancient stone buildings in silver light, and Grace feels a profound sense of peace settle over her. She may not know yet whether to share Evelyn's song with the world, but she knows in her heart that she's honored her story in the truest way she could. The morning sun streams through the inn's sitting room windows, casting warm patches of light across the aged wooden floor. Grace settles onto the piano bench, her fingers hovering over the ivory keys. Ruby stretches out beside her, tail thumping softly against the floorboards. Outside, the village gradually comes to life with the gentle sounds of opening shutters and distant greetings in French. Grace touches the keys softly, playing a few experimental notes. The melody that emerges surprises her. It's different from Evelyn's song, yet somehow connected to it. Her fingers move with growing confidence as she explores this new musical territory. "What do you think, Ruby?" she whispers, glancing down at her faithful companion. Ruby's ears perk up at the sound of her name. The morning light grows stronger as Grace continues to play. She reaches for her notebook, jotting down fragments of melody and harmony. The music flows naturally, expressing emotions she hadn't realized were waiting to be released. One piece speaks of discovery and wonder. Another captures the bitter sweetness of uncovering painful truths. A third melody emerges, lighter and more hopeful, reflecting her own journey of renewal. By midday, several compositions have taken shape in her notebook. Grace pauses to flex her fingers, surprised to find hours have passed. Ruby stretches and pads over to rest her head on Grace's lap. "I haven't written music in years," Grace says softly, running her fingers through Ruby's fur. The creative spark she thought had dimmed in retirement now burns bright again. Each note on the page represents not just music, but a new chapter in her life. She reviews her work, humming sections quietly and making small adjustments. These pieces are different from anything she's written before. Richer, more complex, shaped by her experiences of the past weeks. They tell stories of mystery, courage, and transformation. As evening approaches, Grace gathers her notes together, already planning how she'll develop these pieces when she returns home. Ruby wags her tail, sensing her owner's contentment. "We've got a lot of work to do," Grace whispers to Ruby, smiling as she organizes her drafts. Back at the inn that evening, Grace sits at the small writing desk, the warm glow of the table lamp casting shadows across the aged wood. She pulls out a crisp sheet of paper and her favorite pen, taking a deep breath before beginning to write. Ruby dozes nearby, her gentle snoring a comforting backdrop to the scratching of pen on paper. The USB drive containing Evelyn's completed song sits beside her, its small form belying the power of its contents. Grace considers her words carefully, wanting them to carry the weight of both justice and triumph. After several attempts, she settles on the simple but powerful message. You didn't silence her. Her voice lives on. Her hand trembles slightly as she seals the envelope, but her resolve remains steady. The act feels both bold and necessary, a final step in honoring Evelyn's courage. The next morning dawns clear and cool. Grace walks purposefully to the village post office, the envelope secure in her bag. The elderly postmaster greets her with a friendly bonjour as she sends the package on its way to Langley's address. With that task complete, Grace clips Ruby's leash and sets out for one last walk through the village's winding streets. The morning air carries the scent of fresh baked bread from the local boulangerie, and distant church bells chime the hour. Ruby trots happily beside her, pausing occasionally to investigate interesting scents. As they walk past the stone cottages and blooming window boxes, Grace reflects on her journey. What started with a mysterious suitcase in a park has led her here, to this moment of quiet victory. She thinks about Evelyn's strength in escaping Langley's control, and how her voice, once threatened with silence, will now reach him again, not as a reminder of his power, but as proof of his failure to destroy her spirit. On the train home, Grace watches the French countryside scroll past her window. Fields of lavender and ancient stone walls blur together as the train picks up speed. Ruby dozes at her feet, and Grace feels a profound sense of lightness, as if completing Evelyn's song has lifted a weight she didn't know she carried. The soft glow of evening light filters through Grace's living room windows as she settles into her favorite armchair. Ruby curls up beside her, tail thumping gently against the floor. The coffee table before them holds Evelyn's treasures, the weathered tapes, yellowed letters, and journal that have become so precious over these past weeks. Grace picks up one of the tapes, running her fingers along its edges before placing it in the restored player. Evelyn's voice fills the room, rich with emotion and determination. "I won't let fear define me anymore," Evelyn's recorded voice declares, making Grace smile in understanding. Each item tells a piece of the story. The journal entries speaking of courage, the letters revealing transformation, the songs expressing both pain and hope. Grace touches each object reverently, remembering the journey that brought them into her life. Ruby lifts her head occasionally, offering quiet comfort as Grace loses herself in memories. "Who would have thought," Grace muses aloud, scratching Ruby's ears, "that finding that old suitcase would change everything?" She thinks about her renewed passion for music, the compositions flowing from her fingers these days, inspired by Evelyn's bravery. The creative spark she thought long extinguished now burns bright and steady. The afternoon light shifts to evening shadows as Grace continues her reflection. She considers how solving Evelyn's mystery gave her own life new purpose, pushing her beyond comfortable routines into unexpected adventures. The fear she felt confronting Langley, the excitement of discovery in that French village, the joy of completing Evelyn's unfinished song, each experience helped her rediscover her own strength. Ruby nuzzles Grace's hand as she reaches for the final tape. Evelyn's voice emerges once more, speaking of dreams and second chances. Grace feels a deep connection to this woman she never met, but came to know so well through her words and music. Gathering the items carefully, Grace returns them to the battered suitcase that started it all. Each piece feels like a precious gift, not just for the story they tell of Evelyn's life, but for the way they awakened something in Grace's own heart. "Thank you, Evelyn," Grace whispers, closing the suitcase with gentle reverence. The afternoon sun bathes Grace's living room in a warm golden glow as she adjusts the sheet music on her piano. Her closest friends, Henry, Eleanor, and Mrs. Albright, settle into comfortable chairs arranged in a semicircle. Ruby stretches out contentedly at Grace's feet, her tail wagging softly against the hardwood floor. Grace's hands rest lightly on the piano keys as she turns to face her small audience. "What I'm about to share with you is very special," she begins, her voice gentle but clear. "It's a story about a woman named Evelyn, whose voice found its way to me through an old suitcase full of tapes." She tells them about finding the recordings, carefully omitting the more personal details of Evelyn's struggle. Instead, she focuses on Evelyn's passion for music and her dream of artistic freedom. Her friends listen intently, drawn in by the tale of the mysterious singer from the past. "The song I'm about to play," Grace continues, "is one Evelyn never finished. I've completed it, trying to honor her original vision while adding something of my own." She takes a deep breath and positions her fingers over the keys. The first notes of Echoes of Evelyn float through the room, soft and hesitant at first, like a whispered secret. The melody grows stronger, weaving together themes of longing and hope. Grace's fingers dance across the keys, bringing to life the emotional journey she shared with Evelyn. Mrs. Albright dabs at her eyes with a handkerchief as the music swells. Henry leans forward in his chair, completely absorbed. Eleanor clasps her hands together, visibly moved by the haunting melody. The song builds to a crescendo before settling into a gentle, peaceful resolution. As Grace plays the final notes, she feels Evelyn's presence in every chord, every harmony. The music speaks of both loss and triumph, of secrets kept and freedom found. When the last note fades, the room remains silent for several heartbeats. Grace looks up to see tears glistening in her friend's eyes. Ruby raises her head and gives a soft whine, as if sensing the emotional weight of the moment. The piece hangs in the air like a prayer, a testament to both Evelyn's spirit and Grace's dedication to preserving it. In this intimate gathering, surrounded by understanding friends, Grace feels the rightness of sharing Evelyn's story through music, the most fitting tribute she could offer. Autumn sunlight streams through Grace's living room window, casting a warm glow on the piano keys beneath her fingers. A new melody flows from her hands, gentle yet powerful, like ripples spreading across still water. Ruby snores softly at her feet, paws twitching in some pleasant dream. Grace pauses, letting the final notes fade into silence. Her gaze drifts to the weathered suitcase now displayed prominently on a small table nearby, surrounded by carefully preserved photographs and letters. Each item tells a piece of Evelyn's story, a story that changed Grace's life in ways she never expected. The melody she just played emerged naturally this morning, inspired by her memories of uncovering Evelyn's journey. As she jots down the notes in her composition book, an idea takes root. This piece could be part of something larger, an entire album dedicated to voices like Evelyn's, stories of courage that deserve to be heard. Grace opens a fresh page and begins sketching out possible themes. Breaking free, hidden strength, letters never sent. Her pencil moves quickly as more ideas flow. Each piece will capture a different aspect of resilience and hope, weaving together the threads of Evelyn's story with others waiting to be told. Ruby stirs and stretches, padding over to rest her head on Grace's lap. Grace scratches behind her ears, grateful for her faithful companion who has been there through every discovery and revelation. "What do you think, girl?" she asks softly. "Ready to help me with this new project?" The Irish setter's tail thumps against the floor in response. Grace turns back to her piano, fingers finding the keys with renewed purpose. The notes come easier now, flowing from a place of deep understanding and connection. Each melody carries echoes of Evelyn's courage, transformed through Grace's own artistic voice. As the afternoon light begins to fade, Grace reviews her notes for the album. She envisions each piece contributing to a larger narrative about finding strength and reclaiming one's voice. Her own journey of discovery will be woven throughout, honoring how Evelyn's story awakened something within her. The piano bench creaks as Grace stands, stretching after hours of composition. Her eyes fall on the suitcase once more. "This is just the beginning," she says softly. Sunlight fills the room with a golden glow, and Ruby stirs at her feet. If you enjoyed the story of Grace, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.